Thank you for coming out when you could be home under your covers or out in the streets, down this way, or wherever. Thank you for coming out for this conversation. And I do want to talk about sort of the moment, the inequality moment we're in, the role of people who have advantage or privilege in helping move that along, and talk a bit in our conversation about the elections and that sort of, if you'd like. But I wanted to just start with a story. Edward mentioned that I'm the great-grandson of the meatpacker Oscar Mayer. So my dad used to say, bringing home the bacon has a different meaning in our family. And I did make this fateful decision, and I wanted to give you a little bit of a story that explained that. And just so you fix this, at the age of 26, my first real job out of college was I had a sort of a business training, and I was working with tenants in mobile home parks around New England to buy their parks as resident-owned cooperatives. I also worked with community land trusts for affordable housing, and two of the most successful ones I worked with are on Orcas and Lopez Island, where that was the tough assignment, let me tell you, because I used to go to East St. Louis and North Camden, and then I was like, oh, the San Juan Islands. But in the San Juan Islands, land values were rising, and police and firefighters and teachers had nowhere to live, and so we created these community land trusts for housing. And I think on Orcas Island, the Opal Community Land Trust maybe has 220 units of housing now, permanently affordable resident-owned housing. Same on Lopez. But in New England, I worked with these tenants, and there's one particular mobile home park, Bernardston, Massachusetts, in Western Mass, 30 units. I really enjoyed working with these people. The couple that sort of hosted a lot of the meetings, Harlan and Mary Perro. Harlan was the retired shop steward at Greenfield Tap and Die, a retired union guy who knew how to get people together, and he was really the leader of this effort. And through him, I'd really come to understand just how vulnerable they were. The land under their park was up for sale. If it sold, it would have been lost. The new owner could have raised their rents dramatically, or just decided they were going to build housing or some other use for that land, and these 30 residents and their mobile homes would be displaced. And what I came to realize is their mobile homes were not so mobile. If they were forced to move, the homes would be damaged. It was very, very hard to find another place to go. So these folks really felt like they were being held hostage. And the one way out of that was for them to be able to buy the park themselves. So I was the 26-year-old consultant kind of doing the feasibility study. And one thing you should know, at that time, I had very painful skin acne that made me look like I was much younger than even 26. So I'm at this meeting with the 9 leaders of the park, and they're looking at this 19-year-old with bad skin who's supposedly going to be the one that's going to help them save their homes. And I'm personally just sitting there in agony, because I know how much this means to them. They've built additions to their homes, they've put skirts around them, they've built carports, they've planted gardens, and most of important, they've really built this amazing neighborhood. And I'm in agony because I have surveyed every one of the residents in the park. I know how much money they have, I know what their incomes are, I know what they can afford to purchase, and toward their mortgage, etc. I know all their financial secrets. And I know that a third of them have like zero or negative net worth. A third of them are retirees who have a little bit of a nest egg. But these are not wealthy people. And I have figured out that they are about $35,000 short of what they need to be able to have enough to set aside for a down payment. And so I'm feeling awful, because I'm going to have to kind of bear the bad news to them. But the other reason I'm in agony is because I have a secret that they don't know, which is I have a lot of money. I have a trust fund that paid for my education, and now is sort of seems to be doubling every 3 or 4 years. And I am actually thinking, well, I could write a check. They have a gap of $35,000. I could personally write a check and close that gap, and they would be able to stay there. And I'm actually thinking that I might do that. So that's my situation, the moment I'm in. And so I break the news to the mobile home park leaders, these 9 leaders, and there's a little bit of a pall in the room. And then something kind of remarkable happens, which is this guy, Reggie, says, you know, I have enough for my share, and I have another $6,000 that I can put into the purchase. Now, I may be actually the only one who knows that Reggie has $6,012 in his bank account. So he is putting everything he has on the table. And then another couple, the Dundorfs, say, you know, we have enough to purchase our share and we can put in $7,000. And I happen to know that's all of their money. And around the room, the group goes, each of them basically pledging to empty out their entire bank accounts toward the purchase of this home. It finally comes around to Harlan and Mary, and Harlan says, Mary and I have talked about this. We have enough to purchase our share, and we would like to purchase Mrs. Rivas's share for $10,000 on the condition that she must never know in order to protect her dignity. And with that, they're about $4,000 short, and Mary and Harlan's daughters kind of come in late, and she works at a bank, and she says, I'll write the check for the remaining $4,000. And they cheer. They've closed the gap. And they literally pull out their checkbooks and start writing checks out to me that I can take and deposit in the bank to open up an account for their down payment. And they empty out their bank accounts and hand them to me. So I take that money to the bank, and they succeed. They buy their park. At the closing, all the men show up with like cigars, like they're proud grandparents and parents, and they're getting a little silly, and they're like, hey, what should we buy next? You know, maybe we should buy the Pinecone Diner. And Harlan tells the Greenfield Recorder newspaper, he says, we have been wandering in the desert, but we just bought the land from Pharaoh. We are hostage no more. And Mary kind of comes up to me and she says, you're a smart young man, you know, you could probably get a job on Wall Street. You don't have to be hanging around with a bunch of old fogies like us. And I said, well, geez, I can't think of anywhere I'd rather be, actually. Just thinking what I learned from them. And then she sort of leans over in a maternal way and she says, have you ever tried Noxema for your skin? I said, yeah, I've tried everything. And so I left there kind of learning something rather extraordinary about human solidarity, of people being all in for each other. And it set off a process in me, which was, well, I almost wrote that check. Maybe I should, you know, maybe I should give this money away. I don't really need it. Maybe you know, maybe this money is sort of a barrier for me making my own way. And you know, one of the things I watched was I realized that I had personally, in my name at the age of 26, 3 or 4 times more money than all the people in this mobile home park, including people who had worked their whole lives and put aside their nest eggs. And so there was nothing that could justify that in my mind. Even if it, you know, having just been born, other than just being born on third base. So I wrote my parents a letter. I said, you know, I've been thinking about this, and I would like to, I'm thinking I'm going to give this money away, and here's several foundations that I'm thinking of giving it to. And I put a stamp on an envelope and sent the letter off to Michigan. A couple days later, my father called. You haven't given away the money yet, have you? I said, no. He said, well, can I come talk to you about this? And so, like any caring and loving parent who's worried that his child might make an irreversible decision, he came out and sort of pushed me on my thinking. And he said, you know, look, you're 26 years old. You probably think you're going to live forever. But bad things happen in life, you know? Bad things will happen. What if you're single, but what if you have a partner and that partner gets ill? Wouldn't you wish you had that money? Or what if you have a child someday and that child has a special need? Wouldn't you want to have that cushion of having that extra money? And I said, well, I have thought about that. And then I basically would be in the same boat as 99% of all the people I know. He said, well, then you would have to, I would have to get help, Dad. And he said, well, ultimately you'd have to end up falling back on the government. And that's a tattered safety net. I said, well, maybe I would have a stake in making that a better safety net. He said, oh, you're so idealistic, But I think he was somewhat reassured that I had not been possessed by an alien or Marxist cult. And so he basically said, no strings attached. I understand where you're coming from. And so a couple months later, I went to the National Bank of Detroit and I signed over the papers for these stocks and in this trust. And the trust fund officer is a woman I really didn't know well, but she's an African-American woman. I knew she had grown up in Detroit. And she sort of looked at me, she said, are you going to be okay? And I said, I think so. Because it did seem like somewhat of a leap of faith. I had no idea just how big a mountain of privilege I still had that was almost like hardwired into me. I had to give away the money to realize just how much other 4 generations of stability, of family wealth, of social networks, of education opportunity, just all kinds of white skin, growing up male in the United States, Irish, German immigrant. There was so much other privilege. But at the time, at that moment, I didn't really fully understand that. So I signed the paper, gave the money to foundations, and then I, went about my work, working with these mobile home park tenants and other groups. And then one day, something bad happened, which is the house I lived in burned down. And no one was hurt, but it was very disorienting. I lost pretty much everything I owned. And my one housemate and I, the next morning, are out kind of sifting through the rubble, if you will, and I look up and I see 4 cars pull up. And out of the cars come 10 of these Bernardston mobile home park tenants. And they have casseroles and garbage bags and shovels, and they've come to help us. And that was the moment when I realized that I was going to be okay. So that's my own personal story. The book Born on Third Base that I've written, though, is not so much my story. It's not at all a memoir. But it is stories, more stories. I've written a number of books about economics and inequality. But I've come to appreciate the power of the narratives the stories we tell ourselves about inequality and how powerful they are. And there are some really amazing stories of people defying those narratives. And that's what I really want to lift up. But, I grew up in a wealthy suburb, Bloomfield Hills, Michigan. I actually thought, I confess, I thought I was middle class growing up because my elementary school classmates included Kathy Iacocca, whose dad was Lee Iacocca, and Bill Taubman, whose father, Alfred Taubman, was a huge shopping center developer. And he came to school in a chauffeur-driven car. And my dad drove us to school in his own Mercedes-Benz. So I thought, in the relative scheme of things, I was more middle class. I didn't have any understanding of new wealth and old wealth and where I fit into these things. But I went to a boys' school, Cranbrook School, which is where Mitt Romney went. Mitt Romney was older than me, but I knew who he was. His dad was the governor of Michigan. Incidentally, Daniel Ellsberg also went to our high school. But the school motto was Aim High, which is depicted by an archer shooting an arrow straight up into the air, which, if you really think about it, not a good idea. The girls' school, incidentally, the motto was "Go forth and serve." So this growing up outside Detroit, both seeing the riots at age 7 and then later, was very, kind of planted the seed that there's something there's an end of innocence for me living outside Detroit, seeing those inequalities, traversing the racial and class divide. And that kind of years later really got me interested in, well, how is it we've become more unequal? Because I had this front row seat in the 80s and 90s working with low-income tenants. I saw how real wages were starting to flatten out, and people were surviving by taking on more jobs, working more incomes in a household, taking on debt, borrowing to just survive. So I saw how inequality was starting to kick in and how stagnant wages were affecting people. At the same time, I had this other front row seat as being part of a wealthy family, being part of a family that an extended network and high school friends whose wealth was like doubling, who's we're getting wealthier and wealthier by the year. So I sort of lived that in a very personal way. And then, so when I started to read the statistics and started understanding these inequalities, it became quite real and personal to me. So, I did, for the last 25 years, that's the work I've done. I've done, research and writing about inequality, campaigning to defend the estate tax with Bill Gates' dad and others, trying to draw attention to these inequalities. More recently, in the last 10 years, looking sort of at the racial dimensions of the racial wealth divide. And, the bottom line is we are living in a time of extraordinary inequality. And I think it's very much, the undercurrent of the results of yesterday's election. I think that it was an inequality election. A polarized, unequal economy gives rise to a polarized politics. As insecurity rises, people respond different ways. And historically, we have a history of both progressive populism, kind of the Bernie Sanders, let's look at, the impact of the rules being rigged by multimillionaires, billionaires, large corporations. And we have a tradition of regressive populism. I'm feeling economically insecure, let's focus on scapegoats, people of color, new immigrants. And if you go back and even look at the Gilded Age 100 years ago, the last time we were in a period of great inequality, we had both this sort of rural, prairie fire, progressive populism combining with urban reformers to win fundamental reforms in the economy. But we also had regressive populism, nativism, and the rise of the Klan, and that's sort of that is the terrain. And so we talk a little bit more about that. But one of the things that I've become particularly alarmed about is not just the current level of inequality, but where are we going here? What's the trajectory, if you think about that arrow going straight up in the air? What's the trajectory of our inequalities? I mean, most of the income and wealth gains of the last decade have got not just to the 1%, but the top 1/10 of 1%. The Forbes 400 today has more wealth, or as much wealth as the bottom 62% of the population. The wealthiest 100 people have as much wealth as the entire African American population of the United States. 100 people have as much wealth as 14% of the population. The richest 20, who could fit on one Gulfstream luxury 650 jet, have as much wealth as the bottom half of the population. And the number of households with zero or negative net worth keeps climbing. So that's our current picture, but if you look at where is it that this is going, this is where the French economist Thomas Piketty is very, very helpful, because he's basically saying we are becoming if without intervening in these cycles of inequality, we are going to become a hereditary aristocracy of wealth, where the sons and daughters of today's billionaires will essentially dominate our politics, our culture. Philanthropy will become this huge sector of private power throwing its money onto whatever, maybe sometimes doing good, but sometimes advancing the agenda of the privileged. This is where we're heading without any intervention. If you put a racial wealth divide lens on it, we're essentially moving toward, if the racial wealth divide, which has narrowed ever so slightly, it would still take 228 years for the average black household to get to the point where the current average white household is today at the current level of progress, 228 years. By 2043, the racial wealth divide will have doubled to the point where average wealth will be about a $1 million gap between average white and average black households. So we're not only becoming a hereditary aristocracy of wealth, we're becoming a racial and economic apartheid of society at precisely the point where we become a majority people of color country in terms of adults. So that's where we're heading. If you put an ecological overlay on that, you have to say, you know, is this really good for anybody? I mean, what is wealth on a degraded earth? What is wealth without clean water and fertile soil? That these extreme inequalities and the ecological crisis are, in my estimation, really actually bad for everybody. They're going to undermine the quality of life for everyone, including the very wealthy. And there's a whole body now of research showing how these inequalities really matter and undercut everything that we care about. So, but here's my experience. Some people hear this information and are motivated by it, are moved and troubled by it. But other people hear it and it just confirms a powerful story. I call it the story of deservedness, which is basically the distribution of income and wealth is a reflection of deservedness. The people who have the most have worked the hardest, gotten up early, etc., and they are the most virtuous and they deserve the wealth they have, and if you don't have that wealth. And that's a powerful story, and it's kind of like a Rorschach. People can hear data about inequality, but they hear it through the lens of that story of deservedness or meritocracy, and are therefore untroubled by it. And I think there's a fair amount of challenge just to dislodge that idea that these extreme inequalities, which are really based on deep systemic rule changes and drivers in the economy, is not a reflection of individual effort. You have to sort of work on that with people. So I've come to appreciate how you can publish a lot of data, you can talk about the facts, but we also need to change the narratives around wealth. And how do we do that? And this is where your Seattle resident Bill Gates Sr. comes into my life, because he, responded to this call to, organize to stop the repeal of the estate tax. When George W. Bush was campaigning for president, he campaigned that in his first 100 days, this may sound familiar, talking about first 100 days, he was going to abolish the death tax. Same thing with our current incoming president. And at that point, I got a call from Bill Gates' office. Somebody in my office said, Bill Gates is on the phone, and I'm like, right, But it was Bill Gates Sr., and he said, I think the estate tax is a fundamentally American tax. It's just appalling to me that it would be repealed. I didn't fully understand that came from his own experience of getting the GI Bill, which enabled him to go to UW and go to UW Law School without any debt, that was for him the formative experience. But he said, having also done a lot of estate law, I see how the estate tax works. I see how it is paid by some of the most wealthy people in the country, and it's a good thing. Once we were called to a press conference to defend the estate tax, and one of the people who we brought to that press conference is not a well-known person. His name was Martin Rothenberg. But he basically got up and said, here's why I think, as a wealthy person, I should pay the estate tax. And think about this in the context, I've been now, working, I was working on the estate tax campaign for a couple of years, and I was doing all these telephone interviews with people who were saying, I shouldn't have to pay this tax. I started this company, nobody helped me, and I don't owe anything to anybody. The I did it alone stories. And so Martin Rothenberg got up at this press conference and he said, listen, this is why I think I should pay an estate tax. I grew up in Syracuse, New York, in a poor family. My parents had no extra money. They never went on vacation. But I went to a really good elementary school, and I went to a library that was open on weekends. And in that library, there was this librarian who took a shining to me. And every time I came in, she said, "Martin, I have a book for you." And she knew I was interested in the science and technology, and she would set aside books she thought I would be interested in. So I grew up in a low-income family. Somebody else paid entirely for my education. And then I went to college, and I got a complete free ride through, I went to a debt-free college in the New York system. And then I went into the field of these emerging technologies, largely built through public investments in science research and an infrastructure of investments that built the modern internet. And then I started a company, Martin says. And I started to develop, voice recognition software. Where did I hire my employees? I hired them from the public university right down the road. I mean, somebody else trained my workers in these new technologies. And then a foreign corporation came and stole my intellectual property. And my business was about to be destroyed, but the US went to world court and defended and won my intellectual property rights. Somebody else paid for this infrastructure to protect my private property. And he says, and then I sold my company for $30 million, and I have several other companies still. And don't I have some kind of responsibility at the end of my life to pay back the society? In fact, don't I have an obligation, Martin says? Don't I have an obligation to pay back so some other kid that's not born wealthy like me can have the same opportunities I have? Estate tax is an economic opportunity recycling program. If you are so fortunate that you have over $10 million, that you should pay back to society a portion of that so some other low-income kid can have the same shot that I did. So, I'm sitting there thinking, that's right. Wow, how often do you hear that story? Well, now I can tell you I've heard hundreds of those stories. I've heard them from the Responsible Wealth and the Wealth for the Common Good and the Patriotic Millionaires networks. I've heard people stand up and say, I started a company, here's why I should pay my employees a living wage. This is why I should pay taxes. This is why I don't have any special talent. Just because I'm a big donor doesn't mean Congress should listen more to me. We should have fundamental campaign finance reform. So I find that those stories are very powerful and disruptive, and I've collected lots and lots and lots of them. And actually one of my frivolous but stories is about Bill Gates and I talk about access. We're meeting with 14 US senators in a little luncheon with George Soros, me, and Bill Gates. And Bill Gates Sr. says, he's kind of giving the rap. He says, we believe we should keep the estate tax because it raises a lot of revenue from those most able to pay. It provides an incentive for people to give to charity. And its historic reason is because it puts a brake on the buildup of hereditary wealth and power, which undermines a democratic society. And at that point, Senator Ted Kennedy, the late Senator Ted Kennedy, raises his hand and sort of in a puckish way says, I understand about the revenue and the charity thing, but I don't know what you mean by hereditary wealth and power. So he had a sense of humor. He used to say, I got my money the old-fashioned way. I picked wealthy parents. But I think that work around the estate tax was a real clue that we need to both sort of do the campaigning and make the case in terms of the math, but we also need to change the stories and the narratives. And it's not just necessarily among wealthy people. My experience, this sort of mythology of individual deservedness, also, I was speaking at the Retired Men's Club of Norwood, Massachusetts, 150 World War II and Korean War veterans, all European heritage, and I was talking about these issues of inequality, and I just said, I'm just curious, how many of you, after World War II, got a debt-free college education? And 3/4 of the men in the room raised their hand. And I said, how many of you got a first-time home buyer, subsidized loan, you know, Farmers Home, FHA, you know, Veterans Administration mortgage? 3/4 of the men in the room raised their hand. I said, wow. Anybody here think that was a waste of taxpayer money? And everybody laughed. No, that was great. One guy says, that was the magic carpet to the middle class. I said, well, I'm curious how many of you are helping your kids or grandchildren, the next generation? Everybody raised their hand. We're all helping our kids. We're all, you know, one guy says, you know, I'm the Parental Down Payment Assistance Program. You know, I help everybody buy their house by lending them money. And it really came back to that VA mortgage I got in 1947, 40-year, 1% fixed rate mortgage. That was how I bought my house. Guess what? That was the Farmers Home loan all over northern New England. 40-year, 1% fixed rate mortgage. Imagine what kind of houses, that which launched a generation of first-time home buyers. Our home ownership rate went up by 20%. 20% more of the population became homeowners thanks to very excellent subsidized housing and first-time homebuyer programs that launched a generation of first-time homebuyers. But the problem was it was unfortunately racially discriminatory. So one generation of white veterans, not all tied to military service though, got on the express train to wealth building, and blacks and Latinos were left at the station. And that's why today white home ownership rates 71%, African American 41%. The past shows up in the present because of that. But I say that because I remember having that conversation with the veterans and some of them saying, you know, our children have no idea where their opportunities came from. They came from these government investments, these public investments. One veteran came up to me and said, you know, everybody calls us the greatest generation, but we're really the greatest subsidized generation. And the other guy says, subsidy, that's a dirty word. You know, you could sort of see but I think I say that because I think there's something about admitting help, which is one of the challenges, you know, and particularly for men to say, you know, yeah, I got government help to be where I am today, or I got family help, or I was born on third base, that there's a stigma and a shame attached to that, that I'm trying to, and I think part of the work is to try to get people to tell true stories, not just the very wealthy, but any white, you know, that any of us who have any kind of white skin advantage or any advantage, just to sort of just talk about it, just tell it as part of the story. Don't leave it out of the details of how we got to where we are. So let me close with a couple of just thoughts on in the book Born on Third Base. Part of the reason I wrote this book is because I am out talking to wide audiences of people, but I'm also talking to philanthropic networks. There's this fabulous network called Resource Generation, young people under 35 who are sort of trying to figure out what to do with having wealth, both entrepreneurial wealth and inherited wealth, and having conversations about this moment that we're in, the trajectory that we're in, and my belief that we don't have a lot of time before we need to bring every tool to our disposal to intervene to change the trajectory, both the economic and ecological trajectory that we're on. So part of my message to my own people, people in the 1% or 5% who are affluent, is to come home, to fully re-engage back into a community of place. Not a gated community, but a wider community. So Seattle, Tacoma. To bring your wealth home, which in this case I believe is take it out from the shadows of the offshore tax havens, take it out of the global financial casino, take it out of the fossil fuel sector, which is hell-bent on destroying habitability on Earth, and bring it home to the real economy of goods and service. Bring it to the new energy economy, into building resilient and healthy communities. Bring your wealth home. Tell true stories about the sources of wealth and success. Demythologize the stories of success. Yes, give to charity, and give particularly to charity that funds social change organizing, not just traditional charity, but also realizing that philanthropy is not a substitute for an adequate revenue system and paying your taxes. And I have a study actually coming out next week called Gilded Giving, Top-Heavy Philanthropy in an Age of Extreme Inequality. But we're now seeing the rise of huge mega foundations and increased role of wealthy givers, and accompanied by a declining, alarming decline in giving by lower and middle income people as their insecurities rise, economic insecurities rise. So again, the trajectory there is 20 years from now, we'll have huge, large mega philanthropy, huge foundations, essentially accretions of private power, at the same time that the public purse is facing more and more austerity. And we have a stake in that discussion because for every dollar given away by a billionaire to charity through a foundation, about 50 cents of that gift is matched by, offset essentially by taxpayers subsidizing those gifts. So that's why there's a public interest there. And it's time to fundamentally reform philanthropy. It hasn't been really the rules haven't been updated since 1969. So we're seeing huge warehousing of wealth in the philanthropic sector. So we need to sort of push that along. My message to everyone else who's does not think of themselves in that is we need to organize our communities. We need to organize and defend ourselves against the most dangerous aspects of extractive capitalism. We need to do the work and the organizing around the fight for 15, around expanding wealth and opportunity, around defending now we'll have a defensive agenda around future additional tax cuts for the wealthy that Congress will be pushing through. What I say though is remember that in the context of that organizing, that the wealthy, the 1%, however we think about them, are not monolithic by any means. That there is a segment of the wealthy that use their wealth and power to rig the rules to get more wealth and power. And there's another segment that are aligned with groups like the patriotic millionaires and who are actually using their wealth and power to create a more equal and egalitarian society. And then there's a huge number of people who are just not engaged, who are kind of waiting to be called to something bigger than consumption, who are, in a sense, I think, feeling disconnected from humanity and are waiting to be invited to the table, to be part of fixing the future, and just don't know how to do that. And so I want you to keep that in mind as you go through the organizing work and the campaigning, that yes, there are wealthy people who are using their power in a destructive way, but that there's a huge potential there. And I think we're going to need those allies. Those allies are in the room. They're in the room here. They're in the room, in many of the rooms that you're in. We just haven't figured out how to engage in conversation and bring people to the table. So part of the message is to find ways to invite people out from the gated hearts, gated communities, realizing, and I would say from my own experience, but also from talking to hundreds of people, that privilege is a disconnection drug. It takes us away from each other. Michael Jordan, who was not raised wealthy, but in his memoir writes about how as he became more wealthy, his world became smaller and the universe of people he felt he could trust became smaller, and that he lived with more fear than he did as a young man. And that's not an uncommon experience. It's not everyone's experience, but there is that disconnection, and people want to be engaged. I want to give a shout out to Nick Hanauer, who's here, who's an example of somebody who has been leading the fight for 15, who's told his own story, who's been part of organizing, the fight for 15, the work against gun violence in the state of Washington. Is a great example of how is it that I leverage who I am fully to make change. And I spent the day, as Edward said, in New Hampshire, but I was working with the Next Gen coalition there, all these inspiring, totally inspiring young people in their 20s working on climate change, working to turn out the vote. That was all funded by Tom Steyer. We need about 100 more Tom Steyers to step up and say, look, we got 5 years to change the trajectory of where we're heading here, and let's invest in this next generation and give them the tools and the resources to take their powerful and youthful energy to become forces for change. So that's my altar call, if you will, as part of this book. Maybe let me stop there and let's hear what's on your mind. We can talk more about the election or whatever, but I think come on up and introduce yourself and offer up a question. And
my name is Thomas Murphy. I'm very glad you brought up the whole sociopath trend in the very, very wealthy. They're completely isolated. They don't even know what they support. And that's engaging with those people is very, very important. And I'm glad you brought that up. As far as this whacked out thing that happened yesterday is concerned, it's a tragedy that Bernie Sanders was not the nominee, because his one and only message was get big money out of politics. And the problem with liberals these days is they have all these warm and fuzzy things that they're worried about. What bathroom can I go to? Or the Green Party, or the Libertarian Party. You say it's about unity, and that's what it's all about, but first we get the money out of politics.
Yeah.
And because he had only one message, he was rejected by the liberal media because he wasn't newsworthy. He wasn't good looking, and he wasn't, you know, promoting something that was basically a lifestyle choice rather than a living wage for people.
Yeah.
I'm very glad
point.
you brought that up.
Good point. You know, just on sociopathy, I believe that the distribution of sociopaths in the society are no greater in the top wealthy echelons. They just we have a lot more wealth and power to implement an agenda. So I always let the famous the wealthy are different than you and I, the F. Scott Fitzgerald quote. Part of what I want to, and I really try to pull this apart in this book, is, you know what? Actually, wealthy people are no different. We are thin-skinned. When poked, we bleed. Like people, I'm really struck by how, people say so thin-skinned. People who, they feel the effects of class antagonism. I have this friend who's a Wall Street banker, who's a totally open-hearted, great guy, but does not feel like he can relate to a Bernie Sanders movement because he feels that edge of anger and rage, class rage, coming at him as somebody who does basically banking for a living. I said, well, geez, Nick, this is not Nick, this is another Nick, my friend Nick. You seem a little thin-skinned about it. Damn right I am. How do you feel when anybody hates you because they don't even know you, but they just hate you? You realize, well, that's the human condition. People just, it actually is a barrier. I started an organization called the United for a Fair Economy, and my coworker Felicia Skell and I used to say, our mission is to make the world safe for class war. Because our theory of change was, let's deflect the cesspool of resentment, that's being targeted down the economic ladder, up the economic ladder. Well, my message today is that isn't going to get us the transformation we need. That actually we have to, I understand people's anger, and when you read somebody buys a prescription drug and jacks up the price 5,000%, I'm kind of like thinking, yeah, we should sharpen up the pitchforks, right? But if we want to win over this other group of allies who are right there, ready to be engaged, who see how these inequalities actually undermine the things they deeply care about, but don't know how to relate to the movements that we're part of, that's one of the kernels I have to offer here, so yeah.
Hi, my name's Patricia Robertson. I'm a former public school teacher here in Seattle. I retired about 8 years ago, and now I substitute teach, so I'm still teaching and enjoying it a lot. But I'm very concerned about the state of public education. As most people know, we have a court case that The legislature is supposed to pay full for the cost of public education. They haven't come around to it yet. Our problem is our regressive tax system. We worked with Bill Gates a number of years ago on an initiative to try to change that, but it went down in flames because everybody was so afraid of income tax. How in the heck do we engage these people who really can afford to pay more if there is a more progressive tax system, to get them to convince everybody else that it would be in their interests?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is among the most important work we could be doing, which is the initiatives that you were part of. And they have been successful. I mean, unfortunately, Washington is a complex tax environment, as you know, but other states have, you know, even in the face of this recent election, there's a number of, you know, progressive funding mechanisms that were passed in some states. I think, though, it is about campaigns that get at these underlying stories that justify, you know, and that talk about how public investments have helped previous generations, and getting people to kind of, getting lots and lots of messengers out there telling that story. And I know that is part of the work that you've done, but I think that is, and I also think we're in a, as inequality grows, I think we're going to find greater receptivity. You know, even in states that voted for Donald Trump, there were a couple of states like Maine that also are, you know, passing progressive. In Massachusetts, where I live, we're about to put on the ballot for the next cycle a millionaire tax that is overwhelmingly going to, I think, pass. So I think part of it is what you did in Washington State with the estate tax, linking it to something that comes with a constituency that can defend it. In about 10 other states, they don't have state estate taxes like Washington State. And I'm lifting up the Washington State model of linking it to an education legacy trust fund that then comes with a constituency to defend it, as you all did in 2006. And I think that's part of it, is helping reconnect, you know, the meaning of tax expenditures for public goods that everyone needs and wants. But there's not, you know, it is among the hardest work. So I honor the folks who are out there sort of really engaging on the front lines of those tax fights. Yeah.
Hello, Chuck. I'm Dick Burkhardt. And how about if we get right to what's in front of us, Donald Trump? As you mentioned, he's proposed radical tax cuts on the rich. Do you think that's really serious? And if so, how should we approach it? I mean, this is, you know, if he actually were to go through with this, it'd be really catastrophic in all kinds of ways. But what's your take we should start doing right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the kind of odd little surveys that came out yesterday was that 75% of voters want a strong president who will be able to stand up to the rich and powerful. And that a lot of those people were voted for Donald Trump. And I think it does come to this interesting paradox. We know from polls that 75% of the population believes that the wealthy should pay more taxes, and that the shift in the tax obligations has been off. So I don't think that people voted for Donald Trump so that he would cut taxes on the wealthy. So I think there's an opportunity there to push back if people really understood. I have a little bit of a, I don't know if any of you seen Arlie Hochschild's book, Strangers in Their Own Land, a couple of you. Here's a little window into, I think, some of what happened yesterday. As I said, this election was really about inequality. And it's really about how 30 years of wage stagnation and the collapsing middle class standard of living has affected everybody, but particularly white and rural communities who overwhelmingly came out for Trump. What Arlie Hochschild does, she's a sociologist, she lives in Berkeley, she's, you know, veteran, excellent listener. She spent 5 years in Louisiana interviewing members of the Tea Party, and she was there as the Trump movement took off, and she just sort of followed them. And she went to, you know, the Cajun cook-offs and church, and she hung out and did kind of a deep listening. And really, and one of the things she said is she created a deep story to try to explain to the rest of us, what's the worldview, what is it that people are feeling? What's motivating them? And here's the deep story she asks, or she offers. Imagine you are standing in a line, a single file line that is heading up over a hill, and over that hill is the American dream. And you're standing in line waiting to get there. But the line has stopped moving. Now you are somebody who actually works hard, you're faithful, you are patient. Some of you have made sacrifices. You've served in the military. Some of you work in dangerous jobs in chemical industry and things like that. But you're here waiting patiently. But the line has stopped moving, and actually it's starting to move backwards. And then you look up ahead, and people are cutting in line in front of you. And they are black or brown or Muslim. And at the head of the line is Barack Obama, and he is helping people cut in line in front of you. But at the same time, he and the liberal establishments who live on the coasts are mocking you, are calling you racists and rednecks and uneducated, and you're not a racist. And actually, you work more closely with people of color day by day than a lot of these northern liberals. You just don't like it when people cut in line. So that was the story that she developed, and she tested that out with people who basically said, that's exactly the emotional experience I'm having. So in her words, part of scaling the empathy wall and understanding where people are coming from, not always justifying it, but explaining it, is to understand that. So what are the implications of that? Well, one, we have to get the line moving again. Meaning if wages are flat and falling, and then that part of the resentment is coming from the fact that the line is stalled out. But part of it, you know, so things that lift wages and create decent jobs and create opportunities and get the line moving again. And if the line is moving, people are less worried about what's happening in front of them, as long as the line is moving. But the other part of it is to engage directly on, I mean, there are clearly racial issues, race divisions, people not comfortable with the changing, immigration in a community where they live, is to say, look, Tea Party folks, there are a lot of other people waiting in line. There are brown people and black people who are waiting in line and have been waiting longer than you, some for centuries, and that this is a system where the gains, it's the reason the line isn't moving is it's not moving for most people in the bottom 70% of the population, and that the economy has been rigged and the rules have been shifted to funnel wealth to the top. And I think so, and I think part of it is then for those of us who are trying to understand this, is to, I don't know if any of you have the, I often might ask the question, why is it people who vote against their own economic self-interest? And I think that just, the opportunity there is to actually do a deeper listen to understand where people are coming from. And actually, I highly recommend a book, Arlie's book, but also Joe Bejant wrote this book called Deer Hunting with Jesus, which is about the white working class. So a lot of liberals are clueless about who, they don't like people's religiosity, they don't like the fact that they hunt, there's sort of all these sort of cultural barriers to help people, and that people know if you call them a deplorable, that they know that's what liberals are saying behind closed doors. And I think what Donald Trump and what to some extent the Tea Party's done effectively is just say, I see you. Now, we know that fundamentally Donald Trump's program is not going to reduce these systemic drivers of inequality. So there is an interesting realignment moment happening here, which is this pressure is building all in lots of different sectors for an economy that works for everybody. And yet, it's not going to get delivered. And Donald Trump is not going to deliver it either. So the pressure is going to keep building. And that's where the opportunity for a progressive populism can come back in. This is where, you know, the Bernie supporters and the Trump supporters, if you say the rules of the economy are rigged, everyone's nodding. You know, I mean, I think there's an understanding that. So I think there's a potential, and I think a Sanders certainly would have done better in certain states. Certainly in the Midwest where I grew up, the Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin axis there. That if you had a progressive populist campaign, an effective messenger, you could put together a very, very different coalition. So I think we're in this very volatile time, but there's also this tremendous potential for a realignment. But I think, you know, stopping the worst aspects of the Trump program that will worsen inequality could be a unifying thing across a number of different groups. Maybe here and then, yeah.
Yeah. Do you think that global capitalism can deliver a fair economy? Get the line moving for everyone? Is that possible?
I don't, not entirely. I mean, I think that part of our challenge is to relocalize as much of this global economy as possible, anchoring it back to local livelihoods. Some of the stuff that's being done in the new food system and with energy should be done nailing down different sectors of the economy and relocalizing as much as possible. I think that's where there's a chance for more equitable livelihood. But because part of the global capitalism is part of that vast extraction machine. So the more we can hold down, anchor the commonwealth of our communities and the real wealth, the less we'll be subject to that extraction.
So are you saying that local capitalism might deliver economic equation?
I think it would.
I'm not being sarcastic.
Yeah, no.
Or
I think it would really do a better job. I mean, I think the model that I would look to is the Nordic model, basically. Which is Scandinavian, Sweden. You have a high social floor through which people cannot fall. You have very progressive taxation and investment in public goods. You have public support for taxation of the wealthy. Even the wealthy are like, look at the public goods we get. My kids get to go to school free. I don't have to worry about becoming destitute. So I think that I would, and there's a terrific new book called Viking Economics by George Lakey that looks at what we can learn from the Nordic models. And even the rates of entrepreneurship are much higher in the Nordic countries, startup businesses and entrepreneurship, because people they're not going to they want to start a business, they know they're not going to if they fail, they're not going to fall all the way to destitution. There's a safety net. So I think, and then I think there's just other things to rewire capitalism to the point where maybe we don't call it capitalism anymore, but it's a kind of stakeholder where you broaden ownership, where you encourage broader ownership of enterprises. So there's I think and we don't have to wait for Congress to act on a lot of these things to make them happen. So I think that's part of this evolving new economy that's evolving in the shell of the old, and that has a much greater potential to be equitable. So, yeah.
I was going to ask you to comment on, how the increasing corporate form has caused capital to shift from what used to be the wealthiest nation here, for recently anyways, to Asia, where I've seen it incredible to see what's going on there. So it's caused a psychology here and a fear, which we're seeing in this election. I was going to ask you to comment about that, but something you said also intrigued me. You said a progressive form of populism. And I'd just like you to point out a couple examples of that I could research. But I might ask you to comment on the way corporate form is moving capital and upsetting apple carts.
Yeah. Well, I think when I say progressive populism, it's you know, it's sort of like the Bernie Sanders approach, which is let's look at the role of powerful actors, global corporations, and billionaires in shaping the economic policies, and then focus our efforts on campaign finance reform, things that reduce the influence and power, the concentration of wealth and power. So at the root of our challenges is this concentration of wealth and power. You know, that was, you know, in the 1880s, you know, the rural farm movements, the populist moment. The reasons we have progressive estate taxes and income taxes was those were the fruits, those were the demands of the populist movements that were saying these concentrations of wealth and power undermine our fragile self-governing democracy. So it was really, that was really the impetus of the progressive populists. And there's a, you know, so I think Bernie Sanders is in the sort of, in that tradition today. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for identifying the sort of systemic class economic thing we're in, and mostly focused on the United States. I just wanted to take a, you know, I'm a guy, I was alive during World War II. My dad was in the Navy, and he came home alive, you know, and we were two brothers, and it was fine. I remember when I was in college, I volunteered to go in the ROTC. My dad surprisingly called me aside. He said, "John, don't go into the military." He said, we don't want wars. He said, do something to strengthen each other. He said, we need economic ties. We need to do trading with Japan and with Germany and with everybody else. And it kind of stuck with me, and I'm thinking, just to take this out of, I think a lot of what you're saying is the lens of the United States and the economy here and who are the wealthy, you know, the 1%. My God, in the global sphere, there aren't many 1%ers in so many. And I just am, globalization and global trade has taken a hit in this thing. And, you know, I'm a progressive. I'm extremely disappointed with what happened yesterday, but I'm thinking that I think we can't undo the issue. For God's sakes, whatever we got here, we're still a hell of a lot better than the Middle East, where we extracted the oil and put nothing back into the economy. You know, Africa, you know, whatever. It just seems to me, what is your view on that? It seems to me that sharing the wealth, letting Japan become an economic nation. You know, toys used to be made in Japan, then they went to Korea, and they're made in Taiwan. And these countries, as they grow economically, I think they become more dependent on each other, and they're less likely to join up in sort of the warfare thing, whatever. So I just think I don't think we should be so U.S.-centric in this whole discussion that we lose track of that. Instead, what we do, we got a large military, so anybody that is starving to death and is so damn angry and they get a hold of a nuclear bomb, you know, they come in and we think, gee, I thought we had this thing wrapped up. But anyway, just to speak to the globalization and the role that plays while we're trying to have some kind of fairness in our own economic system.
Thank you for that. I mean, if you think about, you know, obviously we don't want to wall off and disconnect. We are part of a global economy. I think I would, you know, let's lift up what does fair trade really look like, instead of a lot of our global free trade agreements have pitted workers against each other around the world, but there's the reverse of that, which is to raise standards. You can raise environmental and labor standards through trade agreements. You can say, we would love to trade with you and we'd love to open our markets to you, but you know, you can't have child labor, you can't, you have to have minimal environmental standards, so that you raise standards as opposed to push them down. So I think that there's all kinds of ways that we can be globally involved. So you can also relocalize an economy, but maintain healthy, equitable trade options and opportunities. So people are hungry, and I think we need that and we want it. One other thing I would just tack on in the context of what you're saying is there are trillions of dollars of wealth that are what the economist Gabriel Zuckman says, the hidden wealth of nations. I mean, as I talk about these inequalities, there is so much hidden wealth. There's so much wealth that's now outside the reach of any sort of accountability of taxation. And the global elites from Africa and Latin America are moving money out of those countries to tax havens like the United States or the Cayman Islands. So with estimated 8% of the world's wealth, mostly held by multimillionaires and billionaires, is now hidden in offshore tax havens and other systems. And then in the United States, the creation of elaborate trusts that are also putting money outside the reach of taxation. So Sheldon Adelson just moved, $8 billion. Okay. Sheldon Adelson, $8 billion through a series of trusts to his children, avoiding about $3 billion of estate taxes. So people are using these mechanisms. The United States could be a huge champion of transparency and eliminating these systems that also allow a lot of criminal activity to happen. So that could be a very upward way that we could support the global transparency movement. And there are, movements like groups like Oxfam and others that are really leading the way on that. So when we talk about inequality, realize we're just talking about what's known and measured at this point. There's trillions of other wealth that could be brought back to African nations. For every dollar of trade or every dollar of aid that goes to Africa, $10 flows in illicit flows out. That's the wealth of those nations being extracted both by individuals and corporations. So that's, helping countries maintain and hold their own wealth is part of what we should be about. Yeah.
Yeah, Bob Beekman. You mentioned the Hochschild book. I think it's Strangers in Their Own Land, or that's close to the title if it isn't right on. As we look at the electorate, people talk sometimes about sort of a really old-fashioned liberal view that it's interest groups that determine how people vote, or it's policy. And that doesn't really seem to be quite the case, and certainly not in this latest go-around. We seem to have people voting for a candidate who doesn't even have a coherent set of policies, or they're voting for someone whose stated policies will be against their interests in kind of bizarre ways. And there's another theory. I've been reading this book called Democracy for Realists that says people vote kind of as tribes. They go, okay, I'm going to vote for the guy who's sort of like people like me vote for. And that seems to be related to the strangers in their own land, and it sort of seems to me to kind of be connected to a narrative too, this line-cutting narrative that Arlie found in Louisiana. What I'm wondering, and you kind of touched on this already, but maybe circle back again and address it specifically, what kind of narrative should progressives be offering to the people who voted for Trump?
I think it's, we see you, we hear you, we see what's happening in rural communities. We see the shortening of life, the opiate epidemics, the suicides, we see what's happened, and we want, you're our brothers and sisters, and we want you to prosper. We want your communities to flourish. And I think that part of what Trump did, and I think you're onto something with this, the sort of concept of tribal voting, but I'm going to stand for you. I'm going to stand for you. She's about the status quo. I'm about disrupting the status quo. The status quo hasn't helped you for 30 years. I'm your change agent. Vote for the change. And I think that's a very compelling message. I think that Bernie Sanders had a compelling part of that message too. And he understands, coming from Vermont, he understands people who hunt, and the gun issue in communities that hunt. I grew up in northern Michigan hunting, so I sort of have some of that understanding. But most urban dwellers think of guns as murder weapons, as opposed to how you put 2 deer in the freezer for the winter. So part of it is we are becoming more residentially and culturally divided, and part of it is to go outside of our bubbles. The way Arlie did. We don't have to spend 5 years in Louisiana, but you can do more, I think, to understand people's experience. Meg Wheatley says you can't hate somebody if you know their story. And I don't think we know we're in relationship enough. with people to really know their deep stories, to know their stories and why they are, and then to show, solidarity. I do think that progressives have over and over again pushed away and alienated white working class voters in lots of places through disrespect. In the same way, I think progressives alienate small business owners. Here's a sector of a constituency that has a lot in common, but most progressives don't know how to speak small business. And so they unnecessarily push people away. Similar, we don't understand the experience of growing up rural or seeing, the one employer in your town close down because of global trade or technological change. You don't know what impact that's had. And people who are rooted to a place as opposed to mobile, who stay in the same place where their grandparents are born. So I think the more we can do to up our understanding and our empathy game will help that. Arlie Hochschild and Adam Hochschild, her husband, were in the Freedom Summer, 1964, and she went back and she was saying, I was in Freedom Summer, and all the white Louisiana people said, yeah, we thought of that as kind of a liberal invasion. You were coming down and telling us what was wrong with us and what we had to do. She said, yeah, maybe we should organize Listening Summer. We should go and do service projects and, have church exchanges and, amp it down a little bit here. We have more, at the same time, not being facile about challenging racism, racial attitudes, but realizing that those really fester in an environment of great inequality and insecurity. Yeah.
Let's see. Well, watching the election last night, I was especially disappointed with the nationwide results. However, looking at the state results, it was we were a bit more fortunate for progressives, at least. We passed a minimum wage, we re-elected a Democratic governor, and a great deal of progressive legislation was passed. So thinking about polarization and
yeah.
It brought to mind a kind of a geographic divide, which has been established in America now. You have the liberal states. You have 10 states which have an estate tax, and like most of those, I'm pretty sure eight of them or something went blue last night. And so you think about the divide where we have certain states which have these conversations and have this liberal agenda. And I get the impression that that within itself is creating a greater degree of polarization, right? Because there are other states where none of this is actually on the table. And how does that alter our game plan? How can we avoid this separation, and how can we avoid leaving the middle of the country behind?
Yeah, good question. Boy, there's so many different divisions that showed up in these results. But I was struck by the number of states who are doing things to increase voter access, making it easy to vote, and the number of states who are doing things to make it harder to vote. Like the red states are making it harder to vote. But even in New Hampshire yesterday, I can testify to the amazing benefits of same-day voter registration. I was taking van loads of college students who could walk in and register to vote, showing their dorm room, here's my dorm room certificate, and they were voting. And that just removing these impediments to voter access. So I think you're right, we're starting to see some states are the ones that are doing high road economic policies, and that's where the laboratories and the Oregons and the Massachusetts and these different states that are doing these things. I think that's very, very important. And I see you. I think it is helpful to look at it as, look at the county breakdowns and look at the map. It'll probably come out tomorrow in the New York Times. They'll have a very cool color map that looks at actual counties, and you see it's huge urban-rural divides. The urban counties and the rural, the blue urban counties and the red rural counties. I think though it does come back to finding these common issue areas. I was struck, there's one map that looked at voters 18 to 24, the entire country is blue. So young voters overwhelmingly, oppose Trump. So there's sort of an interesting demographic shift on age, both educated and non-college educated young people voting. So there's some you can see these sort of unity points coming forward. I think that the current Trump, the next couple of years will not address stagnant wages, will not address the student debt crisis, will not probably be able to change the dynamic of falling home ownership rates. The things that actually are real kind of measures of pocketbook economic security. So to the extent we can sort of build ecumenical, cross-community coalitions around those issues, that's, in North Dakota, at the same time that people overwhelmingly voted for Trump, they also voted 73%, I think it was South Dakota actually, for an anti-predatory loan law, which was, so it was a good example of a good coalition, cross-transpartisan coalition that sort of found something that actually a lot of people could get behind, that had an economic populist flavor to it. Maybe we have one more question?
One more.
Okay, great. Yeah.
So speaking of these younger generations, a lot of these economic and financial issues are pretty complex. How do we reach younger generations, and what role do we have in the conversation?
Well, I think that the next couple of years we're going to see this huge push around student debt. Now that doesn't affect all young people, but it's a huge one. I mean, 1 out of 5 households in the United States is holding student debt, both the students and the parents. Average student debt, $33,000. And it obviously doesn't have to be that way. So that's a very concrete one. It has no good purpose. It's delaying people forming households and saving and buying homes and all kinds of things. So, I think picking 1 or 2 like that are just clearly affecting constituency and linking it to a way, finance debt-free education, pay for it by a progressive inheritance tax or a financial transaction tax or something that reduces the concentration of wealth and power and lifts up and creates opportunities for everyone else. So I think we want to find a couple of game-changing campaigns, and I think those are the ones that are being incubated that open up opportunity and reduce the concentration of wealth and link them together. I think green infrastructure is another area, so taxing carbon consumption, linking it to investments in green jobs, green infrastructure. So there's a job element, an infrastructure, and a reduction of carbon emissions. So I lift up a couple of those. We actually did a special issue of The Nation on these 8 of these sort of game-changing interventions like that I think are being tested out primarily in states. I should stop, but I want to close with a thank you all for this great conversation and invite you to think about getting a copy of Born on Third Base for you or a 1%er that you love. And I just want to share one other little interesting piece of good news is I was actually at a rally this fall, a march, for a financial transaction tax, this idea of a very small, modest 1 penny on every $4 of financial transactions. In Washington, D.C., there were 6,000 marchers marching through the street. Now, how many of you have gone to a big march for a really good tax policy idea? You have, okay. Maybe you were there. So now the reason there were 6,000 people marching for a good tax idea was that 5,000 of them were nurses from the National Nurses Association. Got some nurses in the room, right? So they decided, so they're marching in the streets and they all have red shirts and the shirts say, if you save a life, you're a hero. And if you save 100 lives, you're a nurse. And they have another sign, their placards say, Heal America, Tax Wall Street. So I'm walking along in this sea of bobbing red shirts, And I see this woman marching next to me, and we just start talking. I said, "Where are you from?" She says, "I'm from Taunton, Massachusetts." Taunton? That's like, I'm from Boston, you know, we're practically related. So we're talking about that, and I said, "So why are you here?" She says, "Oh, our whole union local came down on the bus last night. We got off our shift at 8 o'clock. We drove all night, and we're here in Washington, and we're marching, and then we're going to go meet with our members of Congress, and then we have 2 hours of free time to go to a Smithsonian museum before we get back on the bus and take the overnight bus back to Taunton, where I'm going to do my emergency room shift tomorrow," she said. I'm like, wow, that's dedication. But I said, "Why are you here?" She said, "Oh, that's easy. You see, I've been watching the unequal economy come into the emergency room on the bodies of my patients. I've seen people who have hurt themselves, who've tried to take their own lives. I've seen people who hurt their loved ones because of the stress that I've seen people just like doubled over with stress from living in an economy where they feel like they're on the edge." And then the killer for me, Eleanor says, was I was taking in a man who had presented with a heart attack, and he's lying on a gurney. I said, "Mr. Thomas, what's your address?" And he said, "I just lost my house. That's why I'm having this chest pain." She says, "You see enough of those stories, it's not enough just to go to work every day. Someday you have to get on the bus and come down here and fight the greed and fight the economy and change the economy. And that's why I'm marching for a financial transaction tax. We want to heal America." Have you ever, So anyway, that's the good news, is Eleanor got on the bus, and we may have to get on a few more buses before it's over. So thank you for coming out.